So can you see us all, Adam? We're trying to spread out a little bit. It's a little bit.
Yeah, I think I can see pretty much everyone.
Because there's a back row. Can you see it? You might want to move around that way. Do you want to sit next to Jenny or move around a bit? You all right sitting there? You might look a bit disembodied if you wanted to ask a question. You're all right. Okay. Right.
Where are you guys?
We are in Christchurch, Blackfriars. So right next, in the room next to the church, so that door where they're all coming out is the main sanctuary through there.
Okay. I don't think I've ever been there, but
not yet. Not yet.
Yeah. Come and visit at some point.
Exactly. Well, he is. When are you coming over? Is it October that you're in?
Yeah, it's not clear now. We'll see.
Okay. Okay, so let's make a start. So, Adam, thank you for coming and joining us today.
Thank you.
So we're really keen to explore. So everybody's got a copy of your new book, Let Your Heartbreak Be Your Guide. And I've asked everybody to read the introduction. Have you got a copy? Yeah. So everybody's read the introduction. It'd be really good if you want to talk about the book, why you wrote the book, what it's with the theme, then you and I will enter into a bit of a conversation and then we'll open it up. Is that okay? And what time have you got to finish by, Adam, just so that we know? It's now
3 o'clock, so I have an hour.
Great, perfect. Okay. So let's make a start. So Adam, why write this book? So just so you know, we've just read a book which was based on looking at St. John of the Cross, which kind of left us slightly hanging on the edge of a cliff.
Which book was it?
Yeah. Which book was it? Can you remember what it was called? Oh my God. I've forgotten. We're all blanked it out completely.
Was it Impact of God?
Yes, it was. That's it. Yes. Well done. You win the award. Well done. I'm impressed by that. So we thought we needed something practical, something to kind of follow on from that. And the title grabbed us. And I've read it roughly. So I just thought it'd be a really good book for the community here to engage with. Just so you know, we're made up of members of and participants of the new monastic community here and those on the edge of it, and there will be other members joining in from the church later on. So that's who's here. Okay. So why write the book, and what was your aim for this book? It's really good to hear you.
Yes. So thank you, first of all, for this opportunity to share, and thank you for engaging with the book. I'm a big fan of Ian and the wonderful work that he's done in England in really building up and establishing new monasticism. So he's made it much easier for us in the US to kind of claim that. So I'm very grateful for that. In terms of this book, it happened a little bit by accident, in a sense that, I'm based in New York. When the COVID-19 pandemic happened, it was sort of very difficult to discern what to do. Overnight, all of our churches were closed. All of our ministries were shut down. New York City became an epicenter. Within days, we had, like ice tracks with dead bodies and etc. And so where I am in my community, we just decided to stop and to listen, because it seemed like a lot of people online, whoever was teaching contemplative prayer, priests were, doing masses on their kitchen tables. Everyone was just after a while, I was wondering, where will they find people to participate in their programs? It just seems like everyone was sort of trying to be relevant for, and somehow play a role in supporting what was unfolding. And so we stopped and listened, and then within a week, we were able to establish online worship, online contemplative prayer. And also because we're on Long Island, which is sort of an island that starts with Brooklyn Bridge and goes all the way to Montauk Place. It's quite a few miles, takes about 3 or so hours to drive from one end to the other. And we have a lot of country clubs and yacht clubs, and all of those workers were living together. on those properties, but no one was working. So we made some connections and decided that we're gonna raise some money and try to put those people back to work, and start serving meals to hospital workers who were essentially working 24/7 without, having access to food because all the cafeterias were shut down. And as we were doing this service, we kind of had to find words that would allow us to just speak to people in such a way that they could connect with some sense of God's presence in their lives. And this book, in a way, the initial draft of this book happened as a result of, it's basically based on different sermons, different reflections that I offered on Zoom Church during that time. I tried not to be super prescriptive, but rather to use stories that I've experienced in my life, stories connected to heartbreak, to difficulties, stories about losing and finding God. And so I tried to use those stories, combine them with some teachings from scripture and from some different contemplatives, and offered those reflections as a way of supporting people through this difficult time that we were going through. I did not intend for this to be a book, but then about a year later or so, an editor from Orbis Book asked me if I could send him some of those sermons, some of those talks. And then he proposed that we do a book, and I started re-editing and then rewriting some of them. So this way the book would feel more like a book of reflections rather than, sermons offered on a specific occasion. So that's how this book came to be. The goal for me was to really present a path of engaged spirituality that was specifically Christian, but also that could be open to people who are not so much maybe interested in institutional religion, but yet who are searching for an experience of purpose, for an experience of meaning and significance in their lives. And so that's how it came about. And then I end the book with a sort of a proposal for a rule of life for engaged contemplatives. Some of that rule of life is based on some of the commitments that we make in our community, but I tried to kind of universalize it a bit. So this way it could speak to people in different walks of life, also especially speak to people who are interested in pursuing a life of ministry and compassionate service in the world, and maybe even engaging with social activism and challenging some of the systems that I know in my country here seem to be falling apart at the moment. So that's how it kind of came together. And the book is very autobiographical in a way, because I really pulled from a lot of experiences that I've had. So some of the stories come from my many years of ministry among the homeless youth on the streets of New York City. Some of the stories touch upon my kind of very formational experience of the church in Poland when I was growing up. And some of the experiences have to do with other things that felt very important to share to me. So that's more or less what the book is.
Thank you. And I'm just thinking, pursuing there seems to be a very strong spiritual message to the core of this book. Thinking about that we're about to start reading this book in earnest from next week, what would you say were the key themes of stuff that us as a contemplative new monastic community, what would you say are the key themes for us to engage with?
Yeah, so this book, really is about learning how to be present to all the pain and suffering that is present in us, but also in the world around us. And this really comes from my experience of working with homeless youth, where I discovered that I needed to approach each and every one of them as in the same way that I would approach contemplative prayer. So people would come to our center in New York City, and initially I responded to them, utilizing my therapeutic skill sets and trying to kind of engage with their lives in a way that would kind of be very helpful. And I realized that that was not working. I realized that I needed to approach each of them in the same way that I approach contemplative prayer. And for me, contemplative prayer is about being present, is about being in this state of receptivity and deep listening, in this state of curious not knowing, waiting for God to show up. And so that's what I started doing. And as I started welcoming people into our center in that way, I would often have this experience of heartbreak, because to witness all of that pain, to feel that without any buffers, to accompany people into the depths of their pain, there is a certain shattering that takes place. And I would oftentimes find myself completely broken by what I was witnessing. And at the same time, if I could just be there in that state of receptivity and listening, waiting for God to kind of do something there, I would often find that there was this sense of God's presence that was there underneath it all, and that all I had to do was just to say yes to it, so that energy of God's care could flow into whatever we were doing and essentially do the work of healing on us, work in our midst. And then it wasn't even really clear who was helping whom. And so to me, that is the essential experience of what it means to be a contemplative who's engaged in social justice, to be present to the world in a way where that world can even shatter us, and then to listen for that presence of God that is there all around us, waiting to kind of flow into our lives and to begin to do the work of healing on us and then through us in the world. It was Saint Augustine who had this beautiful teaching commenting on scripture, relating to Christ being asleep on the boat. And he was saying how deep within our hearts, in the innermost cabin of our hearts, there is a sleeping Christ. And when that Christ wakes up, our role is to allow him to live and love through us. And so to me, that is the fundamental experience of what Christian life is about. It is also an experience of who we are meant to be. And this is where John of the Cross comes into being, to allow for that to happen, to allow for that sleeping Christ who's waking up in us to begin to live through us. That often feels like an experience of dying, because in some way we have to cease to be who we are, only in that process to then discover that we are more ourselves than we've ever been, And so this book is really about that experience, about not being afraid to get shattered by the reality of the world, to listen deeply for that presence of spirit, and then to be in a state of consent, having courage to say yes, so God could become the source of our life and our action. So that's really the message of the book, more or less. And, there are different kind of stories and things through which I try to kind of evoke some of that experience, or help people to touch different elements of their lives and their own experience of God that they've already had, but maybe they don't have the language to name it. I kind of try to basically almost do it in the form of an examen, where it's like when we name certain realities of our experience, it's like we can witness them again, sometimes for the first time, really. So that is really what the book is about. And I draw kind of heavily from John of the Cross, especially from that experience of the dark night, even though I don't talk about John of the Cross that much, but that is kind of the fundamental experience. And part of it is that that's what been present in my life, you know. I'm from Poland, and all of our saints, you know, are saints who suffer. So perhaps I have a predisposition for that, you know. Joy, I'm still learning how to do.
Two follow-up questions, and then we'll open it up to Adam. So you touched on it there a little bit about St. John of the Cross. So if knowing you and your spirituality, this felt like a deeply Carmelite inspired book. What would you want? It seems to me that you're practically drawing on quite heavily on Carmelite spirituality, and hence John of the Cross. Is there anything you would say particular about what your hopes are in terms of opening up Carmelite spirituality?
Yeah, so, you know, especially in the Anglican Church, Carmelite spirituality is sort of present, but not in a very explicit way. You know, you look at people like Rowan Williams, who's a scholar of Saint Teresa, and whom, you know, Carmelites in formation read and learn from. You look at people like Kenneth Leach or even Michael Ramsey, who have been really inspired by Saint Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, and also the Sisters of the Love of God, who are essentially kind of in some ways Anglican Carmelites. But yet we don't necessarily name that somehow. And so I think that part of my desire is to make this spirituality a little bit more well-known, because I think that it has a very specific gift for our times. And I think that that gift is actually two different gifts now. Between Saint Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, they give us kind of a map of the spiritual journey that is very sophisticated. Now, it needs to be upgraded slightly, you know, and viewed in the light of contemporary psychology. I mean, those you know, saints lived in 16th century. They didn't have access to some things that we have access to, but nonetheless, I think it's still very, very helpful. In Teresa's case, the kind of image of an inner castle with a central place where there is, you know, God's light there, Christ's light there, and how we kind of journey into that innermost part of ourselves. And then how when we do the spiritual work, that light can just shine through us into the world. And then John of the Cross, in terms of his experience of the dark night of sense and the dark night of spirit, I think that is very helpful. It gives us a very specific kind of trajectory in terms of what the spiritual life is about and what is the goal of spiritual life. And, you know, what John of the Cross talks about is really kind of a Western version of theosis. He's very clear that in his view, the goal of spiritual life is to become by participation what Christ is by nature. And I find that to be very inspiring, you know. And in Teresa's case, she talks about this kind of a mystical marriage and the union with Christ that each and every one of us is called to. So the first gift of Carmel is that kind of a map of the soul, map of the spiritual journey. The second gift of Carmel, I think, is being able to face the darkness of our present age and to know what to do with it. And, you know, St. John of the Cross talked about it as an inner reality in terms of experiencing dryness, in terms of experiencing shattering. But then when you look at people like Gustavo Gutierrez and even Leonardo Boff, during the 80s in Latin America, they expanded that view into kind of more of a not just internal journey, but a societal journey. And I think that that is very helpful. And even in John of the Cross's case, I mean, a lot of this was triggered by the fact that he was engaged in reforming his religious order, and he was imprisoned by other Carmelites and tortured. So it's not like he had nothing to do with the kind of stuff that he was engaging in, in the world. So I think that's the second gift. The third gift of the Carmelite spirituality, I think, is that it's a beautiful kind of addition to the kind of classical Anglican Benedictine rhythm of life. I think that in order to be a good Carmelite, one needs to first become a good Benedictine, because Benedictine life gives us structure and a rhythm of life and a specific orientation of kind of, of receptivity, really. Benedict says in his prologue, being able to kind of listen to life, listen to God with the ear of our hearts. But then what Carmel offers is that kind of next stage when you transition into silence. In the rule of Saint Benedict, there's very little actually that is being said about private prayer. He has a lot of instructions about how to do the office and etc., but very little. I mean, there might be, if I remember correctly, maybe just one line about private prayer. And I think some of it is Benedict assumes that people will be praying in a way that John Cassian advised and others, the few books that he recommends at the end of his rule in terms of what the monks should be reading. And I think that Carmel provides that way of prayer. It's really a tradition that goes back to the desert, it's a kind of, in a way now, contemporary manifestation of that desert tradition that tells us how to go into the desert of our hearts, how to be in silence, how to empty ourselves, and how to encounter Christ. But at the same time, Carmelite tradition is slightly different than, for example, centering prayer, which centering prayer is not very relational. Carmelite tradition, you don't transition into silence too quickly. You engage in a passionate relationship and conversation with Christ, only then to rest in silence and be transformed by that silence. So the beautiful thing about it is that there is no, what some psychologists would call, spiritual bypass, where you just show up for silence, leave all the complicated stuff of your life outside, and then as this kind of idealized person, you're there to experience holy things. With Carmel, it's not like that. You bring all of that. You struggle with it. It has a certain kind of almost Jewish way of being with God, where all of your personality, all of your emotions are included in that. And eventually all of that kind of helps you to reach this sense of receptivity and silence. And contemplation in the Carmelite tradition, as it is in all Christian tradition, is a gift. So all of this practice is really just to prepare ourselves to be able to receive the gift that God is here to give us. So that's another, I think, helpful thing about Carmel. And then finally, the last thing that I want to say, for a long time in the church, contemplation was really seen as this kind of a thing for some special people. Even, in medieval times, I think if we asked many monastics about whether even diocesan priests, whether they could have spirituality, it would be up for a debate, it's the monks who are the special people, but Carmelites have this thing that I would call universal call to contemplation. Saint Teresa of Avila says, no, this gift of intimacy with God, it's a birthright of every person. You don't have to go, sit on a mountain top to experience this. You can practice this at home. Everyone is called to this divine intimacy, to this divine union. And I think for me, again, it's very encouraging in this day and age where so many of us feel lost, when so many of us feel like the world that we invested it so much is kind of falling into pieces. I don't know how it is in the UK, but here it certainly feels, just the other day, I was leading a contemplative prayer for college kids, and it's like they're graduating, there are no jobs. whatever was promised to them, whatever they took for granted that, their degree will give them, that's done. It's not there, so we need God, really, and tools that can help us to turn to God, to really reach that place deep within where we are always held with love, and loved into who we need to be in the world, So that's kind of why I love Carmelite spirituality. And I feel like, especially in the last 8 or so years, Carmel has been kind of my daily companion in many ways,
Great. I think I just got one final question, then we'll throw it open. There was 2 themes I think I picked up. One was about the issue of loneliness, and I think many of us really struggle with loneliness as an issue, and that sense of disconnection. And on the back of that, I also heard a lot about thinking about how do we engage with God when God feels very out of reach. So I picked up those 2 themes. Within anything you would like to say about that as a final thing before we open it up?
Yeah, I mean, I think loneliness is a real thing, especially in the last 3 years. I think for many of us, even if we, have partners, and the way that we do life changed. I'm not sure if it's that way in the UK, but here it is. And we're still struggling to figure out, how to gather, how to have in-person gatherings in a way that feels nourishing. Somehow also our habits changed, and all of a sudden to take a train for 45 minutes to see a friend feels like hassle. What about Zoom, And yet it's not the same. So I think that, that is a real thing. And I've always been encouraged by also someone that I quote in the book, by Henry Nouwen, who talked about the movement from loneliness to solitude as one of the key movements in spiritual life. If we stay in our loneliness phase, we will just most likely be using people as our little anti-loneliness devices. But if we can convert our loneliness into solitude, then real community is possible, because we can be in a different kind of a relationship, where our solitude can kind of give birth to generosity of heart, So I think that's what I would say in terms of loneliness, in terms of, kind of turning to God, who seems out of reach. I mean, again, that is a very complex one, because at least in a Carmelite school of spirituality, dryness and us feeling like we've lost God sometimes is actually a sign of spiritual progress. And I can unpack that a little bit, but I remember, back in the day when I used to travel quite a bit and lead retreats, especially for young people, mostly in places that are kind of spiritual but not religious, like, in England, that would be like places like Schumacher College, or I remember once I led something at, Alternatives at St. James. It's basically like not really for people who are in the church at all. In fact, some of them dislike the church. But I remember, people would go from retreat to retreat and sometimes have powerful experiences with different, teachers, kind of exploring, looking for something that could give them that sense of God's presence in their life. And then oftentimes they would hit the wall. And that meant that they had to change the teacher, change the community, or, get into psychedelics or whatever, something that would give them, that experience. And we have to be very careful about it. And that's why understanding the spiritual map is very important, because in the Carmelite tradition, actually, the first stage is the stage of falling in love with God. But then as we progress, we hit dryness. And John of the Cross is this very beautiful kind of metaphor where he says, he talks about a mother who's feeding her baby, breastfeeding her baby. And the child feels very loved and very close to her. But then there comes a time when the mother needs to put the kid on the floor and just leave him there so he can develop some muscles to be able to stand on his own. And John of the Cross says that's exactly what happens in spiritual life. We have this experience of presence, and then we hit the wall, and it feels like maybe we've done something wrong. And he has specific kind of points to help us diagnose why are we feeling the dryness. But in some ways, it could be the experience of the dark night, which means that actually we're making progress. God is taking us deeper. It's just we haven't yet developed the spiritual senses to perceive that presence yet, and I think that some of us are feeling this kind of a thing right now, like we've lost God, like maybe we've had God, but as a result of all the changes around us, something is happening. And I think that in the book I try to offer thoughts, stories, and also spiritual practices and kind of a general orientation that can help us to start paying attention, I hope, even in those experiences of dryness, even in those experiences of desolation and loneliness and this connection from God, where we can begin to take steps towards hopefully recognizing that God is actually there, that God has been there with us all along. And I think one of the kind of key practices is really a practice of trust, and that is very difficult. But I think one of the goals of the book is to really help people to move towards trust.
Great.
I don't know if I answered your questions.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So let me just make it so it doesn't look disembodied, so that we can. So let's open that up now to the floor. Questions, comments. Go for it.
So I have a question about contemplation and activism, and where you feel the balance is. I'm quite sceptical about activism because I feel quite often people can be hypocritical. They might think they're doing something in their external life, but in their own personal life, they may be doing the thing that they're trying to act against. And you mentioned Rowan Williams. I was lucky enough to be part of a church where Rowan preached once a month. And I don't know anything about Carmelite tradition, but I've heard quite a lot of Rowan. And slightly kind of tangent, he gave a sermon about war and about what is a just war and how do we know if we're engaging in a just war. And his advice was to look at the conflict within and to deal with that conflict within first, with contemplation, before looking at conflict outside of us, and then spend at least as much time looking at the internal conflict as external conflict. And I just wondered if you had any kind of thoughts around that.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful, really reflection. I spent a lot of my life engaging in activism and also in direct care of homeless youth. I also sort of grew up in Poland when social change was really kind of the fabric of my life, and the center of that work for social change happened within the church. Priests were being killed for speaking truth to power, and etc. And this kind of idea of non-violent solidarity, which in our case, I mean, it was scripturally based. It basically meant solidarity in Poland meant that we would carry each other's, that we would be willing to carry each other's burdens. You know, I think in the last couple of years, I should say in the last 5-6 years, my life has been less engaged in the work of organizing, in the work of direct care. I still do some of that, but not as much, as I kind of felt a vocational shift. And so I would think that, you know, this question, contemplation versus activism, I think let's maybe just first of all acknowledge some historical difficulties. Our tradition has had some difficulties with this idea of integrating contemplation and action. Contemplation was always kind of seen as the goal of spiritual life, even though when we read the Gospels, he seems to be, you know, Jesus seems to be very much kind of a contemplative in action. You know, he goes in and out. He prays, you know, and goes into the wilderness or the desert before serious events of his life. And I think that that is a model for us. And then, of course, the monastic establishment comes into being, and you know, also probably some influences from Greece and kind of the dualism, which is not very Jewish. And we begin to kind of think of the goal of spiritual life as a more kind of a contemplative pursuit. It's not until really Meister Eckhart, who has this kind of a wild interpretation of the story about Mary and Martha, where he flips it on its head and says that, you know, Martha was actually more advanced than Mary, because she was able to be both, you know, to be engaged in contemplation and also to be very active. Now, that kind of goes against the tradition, and I'm not sure how he sees that in that story, but it's very interesting that he does that. And now, when it comes to this present day, you know, I think that the world, at least from where I'm standing, the world is in crisis. You know, there are bread lines on the streets just 1 mile from where I live. And so the question is, how do we deal with that? And I think in the book, you know, I offer, I think, 5 points in the last chapter on how to engage in contemplative action. And one of the first things that I say is that in order to do this kind of work, we need to be able to relate to the world and to engage in action from our contemplative experience of prayer and not from a specific ideology. Because when we engage in action from a perspective of an ideology, we tend to otherize people. In contemplative experience, we have a sense of interconnectedness of all life in God, and therefore the action that flows out of that awareness is slightly different. And this is my kind of roundabout way of saying that I think also some of it depends on our vocation. Some of us are more called to be on a contemplative side, and some of us are more called to be on the side of action. When I look at activism of the kind of present day, I see some very inspiring examples, but I also see a lot of kind of things that don't seem to be very healthy. And so me, myself, in the last few years, I feel that I've moved away from the work of organizing, in a sense, not because I don't believe in it, but rather because I think that we need to change some fundamental things in us. You know, most people I know who teach contemplative prayer, who teach activism, you know, who kind of are proclaiming a different way of living and a kind of a dream for a new society. Most of them are kind of living in old ways, meaning the relationship to time is very specific, the relationship to money is very specific, the relationship to the systems that are often oppressive is very specific. and the relationship to overfunctioning is specific. And I think that we need to shift all of those patterns, because without that, I'm not quite sure if our activism or our presence in the world will be just as effective. And so I think I would agree with Rowan Williams that, it needs to always be half and half, that we need to do our inner work and allow for the fruit of that to kind of manifest in the world in a way that is kind of in line with our vocation. And our vocations differ, and also evolve. For a long time, my vocation was to be on the streets. Now it's not necessarily to be on the streets. That's kind of, I feel like I just blah, 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 and didn't say anything. That's the best I can do at the moment, I think. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Can I ask a quick question? So I'm just wondering, it really spoke to me how you describe the dark night as actually a period of dryness where God often can feel absent, and I can very much relate to that. So what would you recommend in terms of, the different practices that you mentioned in the book? And I do have to admit, I'm only in chapter 3 right now. So in order to, find our identity in God and, to figure out what is our, what we call vocation or calling in God, what, apart from the daily rhythm of, prayer and everything, has helped you in particular to find your vocation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think in terms of the daily rhythm and stuff, can you hear me? Because I feel like it froze. Oh yeah, God, thanks. The first practice that I would recommend, and all of that is sort of present in the last chapter, would be to work on a specific rhythm of life. And I know, Ian is sort of the person who pioneered even that language of rhythm of life, in terms of really helping people to have a rhythm of life with, where we can sanctify the hours of our day, so to speak. I think it's very important to have a daily practice of contemplative prayer. And when I say contemplative prayer, I would recommend something that maybe will not seem contemplative at first, and that is to kind of come to God as you are, to name all of the stuff that is present in you, all of your emotions, all of your suffering, also all of your joy, all of the gifts, and then to just engage in a conversation with God, a heartful conversation with God, where all of those feelings that you're bringing can become prayers, where you're not just saying prescribed prayers, but where whatever is coming out is a cry of the heart. And it's Teresa of Avila who said that contemplative prayer is it doesn't need to be complicated. It's like an intimate sharing between two friends. It's like spending time with the one who we know loves us. And as we kind of bring all of that to God, as we engage in this kind of conversation with God, and to do it in the right way, sometimes that means that there will be tears, and then just simply resting in God's presence. Resting in this state of receptivity and listening. If you like centering prayer, you can use the prayer word, that kind of brings you back to that kind of posture of receptivity and listening. And so I would recommend that one has that at least once a day, ideally twice a day, where it's a very kind of personal way of spending time with God. This can also be supplemented with Lectio Divina. So, for example, we can bring all of that stuff to God and then go to the passage of Scripture. I just like to use the Gospel that's assigned for the day. And then we read the passage of Scripture, with our hearts, not for information, but for inspiration, trusting that God can speak to us new words, even through those very familiar stories. And the image that I like, which I think comes from one of the founders of the Centering Prayer movement, Father Basil Pennington, is like in the ancient times in the desert, pilgrims would walk on foot for many days sometimes to go and see some elder to get a word of life from them, a word of wisdom. In the same way, we can talk to God about what's present and then ask God for that kind of a word of wisdom and instruction, and then just simply turn to the gospel. And then after that, engage in a conversation with God about what we're hearing, and then again, rest in silence. It's a very informal way of doing Lectio, but I think that it works quite well. And in fact, the monastic way of doing Lectio, which is the older one, didn't necessarily have those specific 4 steps. This one includes those 4 steps, but in a kind of more improvised way, So that would be a very important thing to do, to have that once a day, sometimes twice a day. In addition to that, I would recommend every month to do what I call in the book the Desert Day, where, what I like and what I prescribe in the book is once a month to fast on bread and water and to just simply spend time alone in prayer, in reading of scripture, simply waiting for that word of life from God. And then, of course, all of that needs to be done in the context where we are in spiritual direction. And in my opinion, even though I personally don't necessarily practice Ignatian spirituality in a way that is my primary foundation, I do have an Ignatian spiritual director, and I think that that's actually one of the best ways of spiritual direction that I've ever been exposed to. So all of that needs to be done in the context of spiritual direction, where we have someone with whom we can process our experiences, someone who is perhaps a little bit further along on the path. And then finally, it's important to connect that to the daily office, the Eucharist, and a small community like you're doing now. I think, in many ways, there's so much conversation about how to renew the church, all the new marketing campaigns and rebranding. In many ways, Christian path is very simple. It's about gatherings like this one where we can sit together, break bread, perhaps celebrate the Eucharist, bring what's on our hearts, and then listen for instruction, from the gospel, but also from each other. That's the Christian path as far as I am concerned. And then, of course, developing the daily rhythm and etc. And so that would be my kind of recommendation to get started on that. And then, you can add other things like a retreat and all that.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Can I push you a bit and sort of say something that perhaps challenges?
I would love that.
Which is that, well, first of all, to answer your question about what the UK is feeling like, I think since Brexit, it feels to me it's a bit like UK brackets USA close brackets, because we're kind of towing ourselves towards the East Coast, and increasingly we're hearing American voices in British broadcasting and so on, and the kind of issues that people are facing over there in the States about working like crazy and yet being poor. Increasingly, economically in this country, everyone is being dumbed down. Basically, we're becoming low wage. And, what I really want to get to is your thoughts at the moment about what I would call methodological issues. Because it seems to me that your book...
Let's keep it on the book, yeah.
Yeah, your book is very much based in quite a sophisticated theological understanding, which you've kind of evidenced to us in your response and in your descriptions.
the question that you get to in your book, in a way, is how will we respond to the systemic issues? How will we respond to the fact that, you know, in the States and perhaps globally, the world is going to hell in a handcart? And you quite sincerely say about things like fasting and so on. And that, of course, speaks to the individual personal response that we've spent quite a lot of time talking about now. But then right from the get-go, in the introduction that we've been asked to look at, there are what I would call methodological questions there right in the introduction about how is it? How? And
Summary now, because we're running out of time.
so really what I'm inviting you, Adam, to just comment on is this stuff that we don't really want to look at, which is about, like, how will we carry on? How is it that new monastic communities actually have a stability and an ongoing life rather than fall apart? How is it that we can be engaged in a movement, quite a lot of sense of different personal directions, but actually how can it amount to these systemic issues being challenged?
Okay.
So what I mean by that...
That's it. You've said enough.
Right, okay.
Sorry, we're never going to be able to get through it.
Oh, that's good. That's
Respond to that, Adam, because we've got about a couple of minutes.
I can also, stay a few minutes later. I think that's a very good a question. I just want to make sure that I understand clearly. You're talking about both stability for the community and also how to engage essentially in a work of social change in a way that's just beyond kind of my individual efforts. Am I correct?
No, because we can all go to ground, can't we? We can all do the Carmelite thing, or we'd all enter monasteries, perhaps.
Yeah.
But the point is, you're not really advocating that, are you? So what I'm trying to get to is, let's call a spade and recognise there's theological sophistication. There also needs to be a methodological.
So what I call for in the book is a kind of a very specific approach, and I think I give 5 points for that in terms of how to engage with the world. The first one that's implied is that you do need to know what your role is, and that is the vocational one. The second one would be, and I'll just go through all of them. I don't know if that's sufficient, but that's where my thinking is to commit to engaging with the world from a place of prayer, as I mentioned, and not ideology, because that gives a sense of kind of, we approach things differently. Another one would be to commit, and in the US context, that's very important, is to commit to doing the work of coming to terms with our social location and how it relates to what Reverend Barber in the US calls some of the evils of our present day, which is the systemic racism, poverty, militarism, ecological devastation, and some of the distorted moral narratives that are so prevalent in the US. And that leads us to kind of really examining our privileges and what we need to let go of and what our commitments need to be. Then in addition to that, talking about justice is not the same as doing justice. So there I kind of offer a few specific examples. One is personal, which would be to kind of simplify our lives and commit to ethical living, essentially kind of making choices around what we support with our money. While that won't change the world, that will have some impact, especially on how we feel in terms of our ethical commitment. And here I kind of quote from Arundhati Roy, who says that the corporate revolution will collapse if we refuse to buy what they are selling. Then in addition to that, before moving to the systemic, I recommend that everyone does engage in works of mercy. And that means that our hands need to be touching the hands of someone who's suffering. And in that, I include Mother Earth. And I say that for a specific reason, because I think that a lot of big thinking about social change oftentimes doesn't make space for the people who are most affected by the difficulties, simply because it's detached from reality. It happens on an intellectual, big picture level alone. And then the final thing that I mention in the book is that we do need to work with social movements, because changing our spending habits or serving others is only part of what is needed. Our lives and relationships do not happen in a vacuum, but rather within systems and institutions that kind of have their own crooked logic and are in need of massive changes. So for me, that is kind of the proposal, where we commit on specific levels with an understanding that each of our vocation will mean that probably some of those will be dominant in our kind of way of showing up in the world. But I do think that all of them are important, from our simplifying our lifestyles and changing habits to serving and engaging in direct service to actually engaging with specific social movements. And in the US, what I really recommend for people in terms of social movements is the momentum methodology for social change that was developed by one new monastic. His name is Paul Engler, and he wrote a book that came out a few years ago called "This is the Uprising: How Nonviolent Revolution will transform the 21st century." And now most of the social movements in the US are using that methodology of social change. And I think the brilliance of what they're proposing is that they are putting in conversation methodologies that normally are in conflict with each other. In other words, people who are working on building alternatives are usually in conflicts with people who work within politics. People who work within politics are often in conflict with people who want to build alternatives. The people who are working within the systems are being dismissed as sellouts, while people who are working on alternatives are being dismissed as not being practical. What they are doing is actually building what they call social movement ecology, and kind of putting all of those people in conversation and establishing that wherever you are located on the framework of social movement ecology, it's not that you're selling out. Your goals should be different, because to affect the system, in most cases, you can only move the conversation just a little bit. But if all of those groups collaborate, especially within some kind of a spiritual framework, all of those groups can then energize each other as they are kind of pursuing the work, which will be very difficult. Now, just kind of my maybe last thing that I'll say about it, in the US right now, a lot of social movement stuff happens kind of within the framework of kind of early left Marxist analysis. My own kind of, if I were to say, ideological location is, I've seen the collapse of socialism and the evils that it produced, and I also have seen the evils of capitalism. In Poland, I was part of the anarchist youth movement that had a very kind of strong mutual aid and kind of reciprocity culture kind of terminology. I think it's very important for spiritual people right now, and I say spiritual people, not just Christians, to not be afraid to say that the frameworks that we have are not necessarily sufficient, and that we need to do better than that. Than what we've tried in the past. And I know that that is very impractical, but the difficulty, like even with some of the activism that I'm seeing in the US, is that eventually, Marxist analysis spill over into the view of human nature. And when that spills over into the view of human nature, and when we accept that there is no deeper reality except what's socially constructed, then the difficulty is that things like forgiveness don't make sense. Things like reconciliation don't make sense, because all we have is just a power struggle and nothing to fall back on, which means that all we can do is fight with each other in terms of who's going to be on top. And so I think as spiritual practitioners and as Christians, we have to, I think some of the Marxist analysis are very helpful, but as a whole, I don't think that it is sufficient. The view of human nature and everything else for us, I think, needs to come from the gospel and from some of the pioneers from our tradition who, I think, pioneered a way of talking about justice that is not disconnected from mercy. So that's kind of where I'm at. Maybe I've said too much, but...
Oh, no. There's a whole subject on itself around activism. Adam, thank you so much. We've run out of time because we've gone well out of time and people need to leave. Do you want to say one thing as a comment?
I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, yes, by all means, please.
I just wanted to and I could listen and engage with this for hours, so thank you.
Great.
Why? Thank
Shall
you
we,
so much.
shall we express our appreciation?
Well, thank you so much, and it's been fun to.
I'm
hang
hearing,
out
Adam,
with you.
but thank you for the introduction to this book. That's really helpful. I'm hearing that there is a whole subject around change and society and activism, this call to contemplative action to look at. We might want to come back to you and talk about that on another occasion, because I think that's a
Happy to do
subject
that.
itself as well. So we'll see where that leads. But for the moment, Adam, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll catch up soon. But thank you for doing
All
this.
righty. God bless and see you soon. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
God
Bye-bye.
bless,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Great. Well, I think